hlas funguje? Ano? Dobrý večer ve spolek. Good evening to everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce. There are people entering. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce the third StředověC JinaX of the semester. We have been in Notre Dame, we have been in Armenia, and now we are going to visit another site which is very important for the history of our research center, namely the northern Italy, the region of the Lombardy. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Irene Quadri, who is member of our staff for 2 years, apparently. She's working here in the framework of the Marie Curie CZ Fellowship, and her job actually is to work on the 10th century culture in Lombardy. So this is really the heart of her research. Irene was trained at the University of Lausanne, where she did all her degrees. She worked firstly on let's say today's France in the late medieval period, call it so. And then she did a remarkable PhD on the painting in the Nord Lombardy, which corresponds today to the Ticino region, so South Switzerland. And she's also MER, maître de conférence, non, maître d'enseignement recherche in Lausanne, but now there is a break in order to be in Brno. Last point I would like to just stress is that her research is touching a region which is I would say one of the most important regions for the pre-modern world, and which is still paradoxically neglected in the research. And I mean, if we speak about medieval Svaneti, saying that Svaneti is neglected, one would say, well, okay, it's Georgia, big mountains. When do we speak about Lombardy, which means the region under the mountains, and which is so close to some of the most neurological centers for medieval and modern and contemporary Europe? It is really a kind of shocking situation. And so I'm looking forward to hear about this shock. And the very last point is that not only this is a very little explored region considering its importance, but also it's a region where we have some of the most remarkable artworks, especially in gold and silver, which are preserved. And I would say that one of the main mysteries is how it is possible they survived, because all army went through this region, and they never destroyed, neither stole out them. And this is even more strange because even the Czech army entered Milan, and while Czech have been there, not everything has been stolen, which I think is really a big moment for humankind. So, uh, having said all that, I think it's more than enough. Everything works. Great. So I will leave the floor to Irene, and thank you for your.
Thank you, Ivan, for offering me the opportunity to present the results of the partial results of my researches. On that occasion, Eusebius, Bishop of Pavia, had a cross brought before him as if he were a metropolitan. Then the same cross that Eusebius had sent before him to precede him with the pomp of pride was by himself rejected with supreme humility and due devotion in the presence of all the people. The cross, very rich in crystals, is still today kept in the sacristy of Santa Maria as a testimony for posterity. These are the words that Landolfo Signore, author of A History of Milan, attributed to Ariberto, who, during a diet in Roncaglia with bishops and the Emperor Henry II, accused Eusebius of having unjustly gone into procession with an important cross made of precious metals and stones. According to Aribertus, Eusebius had behaved inappropriately, being a simple bishop, and had no right to parade through the street of the city, accompanied by a cross, a special right belonging only to the Archbishop of Milan, like Aribertus. Eusebius admitted his guilt and handed the cross over to Aribertus, which was then placed in the treasury of the ancient cathedral of St. Mary to remember the event. The report, most likely, has no historical basis. It is a story told by Landolfo to highlight the determination with which the Milanese archbishop, in particular Aribertus, defended the supremacy of the Metropolitan See of Milan against the suffragan dioceses governed by bishops. Landolfo's text, on the other hand, is reliable in regards to the status and role that crosses made of precious metals and stone possessed in the decades at the turn of the first millennium. They were exceptional objects, commissioned, destined, and used by the top level of the time. Emperor, kings, archbishop, and with Ariberto's good grace, even bishops. The ancient territory of Lombardy, which corresponds with much of the northern Italy, including regions that today comprise Piedmont, Liguria, Emilia, and part of the Tuscany, still preserved many precious artifacts from the early Middle Ages. And this, in spite of the huge losses that most affect this category of works of art, as the gold, silver, and gems they were made of were saleable, reusable, and recyclable. The most famous of these artifacts is undoubtedly the altar of Sant'Ambrogio in Milan, commissioned by Archbishop Angilbert in office between 824 and 859, and studies extensively by Ivan Foletti. A large group of objects date from the decades between the first and the second millennium. Particularly well represented are bindings intended to hold manuscript or the cover of the gold cases in which these manuscripts were stored, which were dismantled in modern times and also reused as binding. This is the case, for instance, of the so-called Pace of Ariberto, whose front plate presents a crucifixion, and the back plate an articulated scene with Ariberto giving the codex to Christ. Or the so-called Pace of Chiavenna, which combines iconic elements, the cross, with narrative features, the medallions with Annunciation and the Visitation. Through status symbols, these objects testify to the prominent role that Lombardy bishops and archbishops played on the international chessboard. They were the highest territorial authorities of the time, presiding not only religious, but also temporal management of the archdiocese or diocese. And since the Regnum Italicum, of which Lombardy was also a part, was under the jurisdiction of the Teutonic Empire, the bishops and archbishops of Lombardy were in turn subject to the power of the emperors. The position of Lombardy, a gateway between the Mediterranean and the Northern Alps, led the Ottonian emperors to invest Lombard bishops and archbishops with important and delicate diplomatic missions, in particular to the Byzantine Empire. In 968, Liutprand of Cremona was sent to the court of Constantinople to Emperor Nicephor II to ask for the hand of his niece Theophanus on behalf of Emperor Otto II. In 1002, it was the Milanese Archbishop Arnulfus who was commissioned to go to Constantinople to collect, with all honors, the Princess Zoe, daughter of the Emperor Basil II, who had been betrothed to Emperor III. In short, we are dealing with the powerful personalities, absolute protagonists of the international political scene of the time. No. It is also Ottonian Lombardy that holds two exceptional works. The oldest monumental crucifix in precious material that have come down to us, the so-called crucifixes of Vercelli and of the Abbess Reingarda in Pavia. The Vercelli crucifix was made for Vercelli Cathedral, where it can still be seen today. Instead, the crucifix of Abbess Reingarda, now displayed in the Basilica of San Michele in Pavia, was originally intended for the monastery of San Teodote in Pavia. The two crosses are very similar design. Both impress with their size. The cross in Vercelli measures 3 meters by 2 meters, while the size of the one in Pavia amounts to only 2 meters by 1 meters and 50. Christ crucified is depicted alive, his eyes wide open. He is naked, his pelvis is covered by a loincloth. The Vercelli Christ has his head encircled by a crown studded with pearls and precious stones. It is likely that the Pavia Christ also wore one. In fact, the back of the head has holes for the hooks that attach the crown to the head. At the end of the horizontal arm, both crosses present the figure of the Virgin and John. On the other end, the vertical arm of the Vercelli cross presents at the top an ascension. On the Pavia cross, instead, in the same position, are the symbol of the sun and the moon. At the bottom, both crosses represent the donor. In Vercelli, the donation scene is surmounted by an anastasis. The Vercelli cross was the victim of an act of vandalism in 1983 that almost completely destroyed it. During the restoration that followed the event, it was possible to identify the parts that had been reworked or completely replaced over the time. Still substantially authentic are the figure of Christ and the relief of the Ascension, so I come back. While the figure of the Virgin and John, the relief with the anastasis and the donor were replaced in 16th century. As far as the dating of the original part is concerned, one fixed point is the Pavia cross, on the dating of which there are few doubts. The donor, depicted at the feet of Christ, and whose name appears in the inscription, has been identified as Reingarda, abbess of the monastery of St. Maria in Teodote, documented in 963 and 965. For the crucifix of Vercelli, on the other hand, we do not possess any evidence to establish its precise chronology. Researchers have combined intrinsic and extrinsic clues to try to place the cross in the time, a time that must not have been so distant from that of the Reingarda crucifix, given their similarities. The exceptional nature of the work suggested an equally exceptional donor. Because of the presence of the Bishop Leo, a prominent personality in charge between 999 to 1026, scholars have linked the commissioning of the crucifix to him. The historical connection was confirmed by the formal analysis of the crucifix and the relief with the scene of the Ascension, which presents similarities with the Lombard works of the period. The close examination of the works during the restoration made it possible to understand how they were made from a technical point of view. The cross, the relief, and the body of the crucifix were made by assembling metal sheets individually embossed on a sculpted support and then fixed to each other with nails. In the case of the Celli cross, the body was made from 4 large sheets. These sheets form a large T-shape that including not only the relief forming the body of Christ, but also the flat parts covering the entire cross. So these parts here. Afterward, the metal structure, was turned upside down, and a liquid mixture of organic and inorganic material was poured inside. This. A wooden core inserted in this mixture had the function of lightening the filling. Once the support had solidified, the sculpture could be turned and fixed to the cross. This was a sophisticated technique which left nothing to chance, since the inner core followed the pattern of the metal relief. It did not weigh down on the metal sheets. Therefore, the crucifix was guaranteed strength and longevity without any deformation. The head of the 2 Christs, as well, were individually embossed and gilded with gold lace. The intriguing eyes were made of cloisonné enamel. The 2 crucifixes appear to us today as meteors, the only survival of a typology of cult objects about which we possess little data. Luckily, the written sources provide fundamental clues on the first monumental crucifix in precious metal. They appear in the sources from the 9th century onward. They seem to first appear in the territory that correspond to present France and then spread to the surrounding regions. There are 2 examples of sources that speak about these first examples of monumental crucifixes. The interpretation of sources is delicate, as the margin of interpretation is always very wide. However, we have reason to believe that these monumental-sized metal crucifixes were the earliest testimonies of three-dimensional sculpture since the late antiquity. This kind of sculpture was a typical expression of the visual culture of the Greek-Roman world. Its mimetic qualities made it unsuitable for conveying the metaphysical contents of the new Christian religion, which therefore favored 2-dimensional media like painting and mosaic. As a result, 3-dimensional monumental sculpture suffered an abrupt slowdown during the first centuries of the early Middle Ages. When experimentation with life-size sculpture began again in the 9th century, it was done by representing the Christ on the cross, the emblem of the Incarnation. Made of silver and gold, this way the only legitimate form of image, as the famous word of Bernard d'Angers visiting the statue of Saint Foy of Conques attest a century later. Concerned about the risk of idolatry related to simulacra of saints, he clearly states that, I quote, "It seems an impious crime and an absurdity that a plaster or wooden and bronze statues is made, unless it is the crucifix of our Lord. The Holy and Universal Church accept this image in either carved or model form, because it arouses our affective piety in the commemoration of our Lord's Passion. Most probably, the use of gold and silver for the execution of these early monumental crucifixes has a dual function. In addition to their allegorical significance, to which I will return shortly, gold and silver made it possible to limit the effect of mimicry, thus averting the danger of confusing the object with the worshipped person. Only later, when monumental three-dimensional sculpture became part of a shared visual culture, polychrome wood was used, which allowed for expressive forms that were more in keeping with reality. Behind the emergence of these monumental crucifixes is the concurrence of multiple factors. At the Carolingian court, for instance, there is a growing interest in the historical dimension of the Passion of Christ. This could be explained by the increasing importance of the Adoratio Crucis liturgy during the Holy Week. The Adoratio Cruci was celebrated, as nowadays, on Good Friday, the day on which Christ's death was commemorated. The highlight of the liturgy was the veneration of the cross displayed in front of the altar. Here, the crucifix served to evoke the Historia, helping to recreate a specific moment in the events of Christ's Passion and thus allowing the beholder to participate in it. The rise of monumental image of the crucified Christ also seems to be relating to the theological debate of the real presence of Christ's body and blood in Eucharistic bread and wine. The debated idea that during the Mass, bread and wine were transformed into the body and blood of Christ provide the first steps toward the dogma of transubstantiation. The crucifixes of Vercelli and Pavia attest to a continuity between the Carolingian and Ottonian worlds. We have no coeval sources allowing us to understand how and in what way they were used. Two late texts, one from the 15th century and other from the 18th century, describe in detail the role of the Vercelli crucifix in the rituals of Holy Week. Repeatedly covered and uncovered by vela made of precious fabric, it was carried in procession on Palm Sunday. It was venerated on Good Friday during the Adoratio Crucis and finally unveiled during the celebration of the Resurrection on Easter Sunday. It is highly likely that the two Lombard crucifixes were at the center of the numerous solemn processions associated with the major feasts of the liturgical calendar. A similar display is recorded for monumental gold and silver crucifixes pertaining to the northern regions of the empire. An open question, however, is that of the visibility of these monumental crucifixes during the everyday life. Sources from the 12th century tell us that the golden crucifix in Mainz Cathedral, now lost, and the silver crucifix in the Ivrea Cathedral, as well lost, were kept in the sacristy and displayed inside the church only in the presence of high secular dignitaries. Both crucifixes have been analyzed from the perspective of technique, state of preservation, and materials. However, they lack perspective in the broader coeval context. Amongst the most recent publications on the topic, one must mention is the book Christ on the Cross, the Boston Crucifix and the Rise of the Monumental Wood Sculpture, 970 1200. Focusing on wooden crucifixes, the authors only marginally mention the crucifixes of Vercelli and Pavia. Once again, they remained in the shadows. This reticence was probably due to the unusual iconography of these objects, especially because they combine the representation of the naked and humiliated body of Christ on the cross with that of the triumphant Christ who, equipped with the crown, is the ruler of the universe. Therefore, they don't belong neither to the visual tradition of the living Christ on the cross, represented, for example, by the Volto Santo of Lucca, nor to the one related to the dead Christ in cross. The latter is best represented by the marvelous Geros crucifix in Köln Cathedral. When trying to interpret this iconographic mixture, a peculiar element seems to me to be the crown worn by the Christ of Vercelli. The crown has been the subject of much debate. Many scholars have considered it an addition of the late Middle Ages. However, restorations have shown that the crown was probably part of the original set of the Vercelli crucifix, proving right those scholars who linked it to the imperial crown made for Otto I, now exhibited in the Schatzkammer of the Hofburg in Vienna. The iconography of the crowned Christ made its appearance in Ottonian visual culture in the last 2 decades of the 10th century, and also affected crucifixes. One of the oldest examples is the Maastricht crucifix, probably executed in Trier during the penultimate decade of the 10th century. Here the crown is made up of 3 precious stones. Another illustrious example is the crucifix in the Utah Codex, illustrated in the scriptoria of Regensburg at the beginning of the 11th century. As demonstrated by Robert Dashman, these Ottonian crowned Christ are the result of a long journey beginning in the 1st century of the Christian era. The idea of the kingship of Christ is, in fact, very ancient. The privileged attribute of Christ the King until the Ottonian era, however, is not the crown, the insignia of temporal and terrestrial power of kings and emperors, but the wreath or diadem, symbols of victory over the martyrdom on the cross and of kingship. I take the example of the Utrecht Psalter, yes, and you can see here the wreath, that it's not already on the Christ's head. It's just at the top of the cross. Likely, it is therefore in the Ottonian context that the image of Christ with the crown is used for the first time. This important change is explained by the specificities linked to the imperial ideology, which consider the sovereign Typus Christi and Vicarius Christi. The prototype was no longer the biblical kings of the Old Testament, David or Solomon, as was the case for the Carolingian ruling class, but Christ himself. Ottonian emperors were consecrating following the example of Christ, and this is confirmed by the fact that they were called Christus Domini. The sovereignty of Christ in the kingdom of heaven found a counterpart in the sovereignty of the Ottonian emperors on earth. In the field of visual culture, this typological relationship was expressed through the accentuation of the kingship of Christ, whose principal attribute was obviously the crown. The link between the two Lombard crucifixes and the imperial ideology is not really surprising, especially if we consider the proximity of both Raingarda and Leo of Vercelli to the Quadri realm. In the second half of the 10th century, Pavia counted some of the most important monasteries of the time, centers of the new reform spirituality introduced by Maiolus of Cluny. Maiolus was called to Pavia by Adelaide, the wife of the Emperor Otto II, who resided in former capital of the empire for a long time. It is likely that the monastery of Santa Maria in Teodote was also part of these monasteries. As for Raingarda, documentary evidence make her a key character. Otto I confirmed to her the privileges of the monastery, thus granting the imperial protection. If contacts between Raingarda and the emperors can only be deduced from the little data available, those between Leo and the Emperor Otto III are well known and documented. Leo was part of Otto III's inner circle. In fact, before becoming Bishop of Vercelli, he worked within the imperial chancellery, holding the position of imperial logoteta, thus intervening not only in the compilation, but also in the conception and elaboration of imperial political actions. Finally, the choice of material deserves our attention. Thanks to the recent studies on materiality, we now know that the choice of materials has a value in itself, contributing significantly to the meaning of the artwork. Since God is light, as the pinnacles of Giotto altarpiece illustrate so well, you can see the angels that protect their eyes with a sort of sunglasses, sort of sunglasses. So, since God is light, and the earthly world is a faded and imperfect replication of the heavenly world, reflected materials such as gold and silver were the most suitable not only to represent divine light, but also to convey it, allowing one to come into contact with it. And why silver is often mentioned in the Bible in conjunction with gold as a material connoting the divine and its emanation, there is no doubt that silver cannot compete with gold. Less expensive and corruptible, silver darkens over time, while the organoleptic properties of gold remain unchanged. Therefore, gold holds first place in the hierarchy of materials. In the end, one might ask themselves why gold was not chosen to represent the Son of God on the cross, but silver, all the more since the use of gold is attested both for monumental three-dimensional sculpture and for monumental crucifix. This is demonstrated, for instance, by the Virgin of Essence and by the already mentioned lost crucifix of Mainz, both made in gold. The answer perhaps comes to us from a text by Gregory the Great, in which it is said that silver represents Christ's humanity, while gold represents his divine nature. That being said, we could suppose the following facts. The emphasis on Christ's humanity to the use of silver contributes to better express the humanity and humility of Ottonian emperors. As Robert Deschman has written, I quote, "The humble devotion and servitude of the emperors to Christ imitates Christ's humility on the cross." Unquoted. In the end, the case study provided by the Lombard silver crucifixes demonstrate the key role of this region for the understanding and the studying of the Ottonian culture. In fact, the Lombard artistic production is essential to shed light on aspects that would remain in shadow if we consider only the German regions of the empire. Thank you.
Much, Irene, for these wonderful objects and then this demonstration, which is very convincing. So now silver is the human part. I would like to have a bit of silver for my cover my humanity. Not speaking about anything else, obviously. This was slightly heretic, but anyhow, I would like just
Emperors
oh,
where?
well, Ottonian emperors. It's a good beginning. Um, Thank you. Very fascinating, and I really like this point with also the issue of the crown as a sign of this promotion of the empire down. Um, do we have any evidence of even later perception of this idea of the naked and crowned Christ or not?
I don't know. I don't have. I don't have. Uh, I don't. Sorry. I can't find a comparison for the moment, but I'm still looking for them. So for the moment is I started to work on metal crucifix
Few months ago.
few months ago. So I'm in yes in the making of the research. So I don't know.
Oh, good.
Even
It's
sorry.
really interesting because it's still something amazing, right? Naked body with this huge cross on it. Anyhow, I'd like to open the debate to the audience. Do we have questions, considerations, curiosities, doubts, possibly? Ian, please. Let's repeat the question for the audience online. The question of Ian is if actually there is something topical for the Ottonian imperial representation, which will then disappear later, and how to explain it, isn't it? This is the question.
I don't think that the connection is so automatic. Uh, I have to say that in this same period you have already dead crucifix on the cross, like the Gero cross, for example. But I think that the question is the use of the two typologies of crucifixes, because the Gero cross was for um, the tombs of the Archbishop Gero. And the Vercelli crucifix or the Pavia crucifix didn't have these, they weren't used in this way. So there wasn't the funerary connotation of the Gero cross. So, and I don't think that the evolution of the iconography of the Christ dead is directly linked to the fall of the Tonian power.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah. Um, I wondered, how do you reconcile your reading of the material, the silver, as a sign of Christ's humanity and the humility that stands in this use of the silver, with the fact that he wears a crown that moves him again away from that role?
That the interesting point of these crucifixes is this dual and only apparent contradictory, as I can say, this way of representation. I think that the crown is useful to link the object. I think it's just yes, it's just an hypothesis, to link to the Ottonian ideology, but in the other end, they expressed the humility of the emperor. So imperial connotation, but humility, that are combined in the same objects, and that they are expressed with material and with the attributes of the crown.
No, and duality is always there. This is the game of all Christian issues, right? You're always in between. I like it. More questions? I do not see arms raised up. If not so, we will express once more our gratitude to Irene.
Thank you. What do you think me?
And I'll just take the last minute to remember a few things. First of them is that the next StředověC will be on the 15th of May with Paulina Horvátova, who will finally lead us to Trumpland, and she'll give us the opportunity to admire how Hagia Sophia has been reshaped by Frank Lloyd Wright. So something interesting to understand how an icon of modernism deals with an icon of the Byzantine world. So this is number one. Number two, which is actually much more close, is that tomorrow evening in Prague, there will be the screening of our movie Stříbrný štít Gruzie, the silver, the humble mountain of Georgia, right? And this will be at 7, Guyana, isn't it? At, I don't see where it is now, the place. Anyhow, Kino? Kino Piloti. Okay, at the cinema in Prague, you are more than welcome. All information should be available on all possible social media. I hope so. And last but not least, between the 16th and the 17th of May, will be hold our first ever festival organized by our research center, which is called, by the way, Recent now. And this is called Libre. There will be books, movies, conferences. A new book will be digitized, as we say in Czech, and many other things will be happening. A movie on Kong will have his premiere. All the production of our center will be screened in one day. So for those who like, the all night looking to the Lord of the Rings, this is the occasion to have it with our movies. Much more fun than Jackson, obviously. And well, it will be a great event, and there will be sausages, I guess, and beer. So we are all invited to participate. And very last thing, this is a matter of proud, but still, or pride, but anyhow, we published this book, which is the heaviest book in the history of the center. You can kill people with it, apparently, but this is the result of 4 years of our work, and this is the result of our work on Kong across this time. You can buy it, obviously, if you want, but even more, it's a magnificent object produced by Kristinka Smerčková, and which actually deserves to be at least touched and read, mainly because I hope that with Adrian Palladino and all the other authors of the book, we did a reasonable job. So this was the advertising part. I should still say that you should push on the button down. Don't put like, this is too ridiculous. But if you have further question to add, you can do it. And we are hoping to be all together here physically and possibly also online in May with Paulina. And then the day after, we will start with the festivities with our Libre Festival. So thank you so much.